Cranksets, bottom brackets. Is it a mystery on older bikes, newer bikes? It is for a lot of people, and there's a lot of specialty tools for those. We're gonna take a look at the older style, which is this on this particular Nico Trek. It is a square taper, and I can just tell by looking at it, it's a square taper. But that's my professional eye, but you need to pop it open to actually know for yourself. I'll show you how to do that and what tools you need to use after this.
Welcome to I Know a Guy Bicycles.
Welcome to I Know a Guy Bicycles, hanging out with the guy. Hi, I'm Justin, the guy. Obviously, I have a garage shop. Taking scary how to use bikes one bike at a time.
If you like these videos, please like and subscribe.
So go back in time. When they had bottom brackets and cranksets put on bikes instead of the one piece that we used to have on kids on our BMX bikes back in the day. They still put those on cruisers, but when they switched over to a three-piece bottom bracket, which means two crank arms and a bottom bracket, that's your three pieces, they used to call it a cotter pin. A cotter pin was this tricky little wedge piece that they put through the actual crank arm to hold it in place. I haven't worked on one since the 90s, but I worked on a few of them in the 90s. Schwinn's had a lot of them that we worked on, the old World of Sports, that kind of thing. Well, most likely you won't see one of those. And if I do come across one of those, I'll definitely make a video of it. But the other common oldie but goodie is the square taper. And even on today's newer bikes, you'll still see a few of those on the lower end ones or mid-range. And they're still available today, and you still get your replacement parts as well. And to identify those, you need to pop these actual crank arm bolts out. This one, it takes a 8mm, and again, I use the longer one so you can get leverage. So you can try to muscle it, or my fancy little trick is taking the old school toe strap, or you can use some kind of a strap mechanism. I like to thread this through the non-drive side. This what secures the crank arms, helps me keep it in place so I can get leverage. Leverage is always key because these cranks a lot of times get kind of tight over the years, or they're overly tightened at the manufacturer. So that way I get an extra little leverage there, so I'm not fighting that when I'm putting all my energy into the actual bolt. And I use a longer Allen so I can use a cheater bar if I need to as well. First time dropping it. So once you get the crank bolt out, and when the bottom brackets are usually sold with these, or they used to, with these in them, so you want to make sure it matches. So what we're looking at is a square taper that's going to be inside here. When you look at the Holotech 2 and also the ISO bottom brackets, sometimes they'll have a self-extracting bolt on them. The square tapers never really did. They just didn't have the idea or concept around it at the time. So you will have two nuts or bolts, and then you'll need to use, Park makes a CCP 22, which is this one here. It is the skinnier version of the one that does the ISO and also the Shimano Holotech, which you can see there's two different sizes. This one's going to be too big and it's going to run up against the actual crank arm. This is skinnier to fit over that square taper. Let's take a look at the square taper. So this is the square taper. And it's square on this side, and as you can figure, it's tapered. So this works, two independent pieces. So this is the thread portion that goes into the crank arm itself. You want that to be able to go on there smoothly. You don't want to cross thread those because this is steel, hardened steel, and this is alloy. And you don't want to damage those as you're putting it on there. And once you get it on there tight, you want to take a wrench and make sure it is snug. You don't over tighten it, just enough to hold its position. So when you apply the bolt that goes through to push onto that bottom bracket square taper, And I use my strap here to give me leverage to hold on to it. Then, yeah, we force it. And the reason why these are short-handled is because the idea is you can take the crank arm off with the pedal still on there. So the pedal's here, but it's still on here. I personally like them longer, but you know, that's why I have a cheater bar to pull that. And you'll feel it give, and once it gives, it slides right off. This is your square taper. And taking the tool, you can see the center portion, that piston pushed it through to take that crank arm off and slide. So what gets compromised on these older school guys is if they loosen up, the square taper will start, this is alloy again, this is hardened steel, this will start boogering up the contact points. These contact points, if they're not flushly contact, this will work its way off and loosen up. So a weird thing we used to do back in the 90s to clean those up for customers that didn't want to replace their crankset. So we would take, we call it the pop can shim. So we would take a soda can and cut strips and use those alloy strips in there to put it in there. It was like a Band-Aid. It was not a perfect solution, nor really a solution, but we tried it anyway. So you wanna make sure they're clean and not boogered up. You'll see it's not flush if it's is boogered up. So this is what you do to take off the crank arm to actually get to the bottom bracket to replace it, or to clean these guys. So basically we're repeating on this process here on the non-drive side. Use my strap, keep it in place. This helps me with leverage on this side here. And I kind of get my body into the bike to hold it as I take that crank arm bolt out. And again with the dropsies. Since I just used it, I have to unscrew this back out so this piston goes flush so it doesn't push up there, so I can thread these in all the way. And you want this thread all the way down to the contact point, so hold this in place, lightly thread it in. And again, this is hardened steel versus alloy. If you have a hard time getting that to thread in there easily, if this has got boogered up through here, you can take like a box knife or a knife to kind of carve that first thread so to help it so it doesn't cross thread. Also, you want to make sure these are in all the way, but if it's in partially like this and I pull, it'll strip out those threads. And if it strips out those threads, it's going to be really hard to get that crank arm off, and if you can't get it off, you got to cut it off. That's the nightmare situation. So you want to make sure you thread this down all the way till it stops, then tighten it just a little bit more, make sure it's secure, then you proceed to do the extraction, the polar portion. It threads in and they get stiff when it contacts that bottom bracket. Then you just give it a good up like so, and it'll give, and bam. Now we're exposed to the bottom bracket. There you go. And this will be too tight for my fingers to loosen up, so just take that wrench, loosen that guy back up. And that's how you take the crank arm off. So if you're either doing it to clean or replace the bottom bracket, this is a cartridge bottom bracket. So basically it's a sealed bearing within itself. This has a specialty tool, which is a spine kind of looking thing that matches up. And this one is a park tool. I think it's DBT32. I'll put it in the comments below which tool it is. You want to do the non-drive side first versus the drive side. And you get this in here. So when you're pedaling backwards, it's tightening. If you're pedaling forwards, it's loosening. So I need to get in there. So you might get this to wiggle up a little. So what you do is tighten this up. Hold it here flush. If you need to secure that tool, you can use the actual nut itself and a big spacer to hold that place. But right now we're just gonna see if we can tap it loose. Get that tool in there, secure, and give it a little love tap. So it kind of breaks free. And this is gonna be the cup side of the bottom bracket. And the reason why they call it the cup side, back in the day we used to have to adjust these, it would be loose ball bearings. And it'd have a locking washer on it. But these are just Cartridge, which is kind of cool. Makes it easy to work on. So that's your cup side. And you proceed to the other side. You can see the exposed bearing there of the cartridge, still sealed. So onto the regular cartridge portion. This is the body of it, same kind of thing. And pedaling forward again is the direction we want to go to kind of move this tool in place. So I'm going to hold it secure with my hand here and give it a love tap. Now it's kind of hopefully break it free. Get a little better leverage. And this is the full bottom bracket cartridge portion here. So if you need to replace or upgrade, this is what you'll need to do. So what do you need to figure out, right? To figure out what kind of bottom bracket you want to use or need to replace. Let's say this is all bad. These are going to have some markings on it. This is a 73, which is the shell width. And you need to know the length. And that is not being stamped on here. To identify the length of it, you do a metric ruler, and this is, or you can do calipers, but this looks like a 110 millimeters length, and the 73 is the shell. You need to accommodate here, end to end. So those are the two measurements you'll need, and you got to make sure. So 73 110 millimeter with square tapered. That's the three things you need to know if you're going to replace this. And back in the day, they had Shimano, a whole bunch of them. I used to stock like 2 of each because you never know what you need to come across. They weren't too terribly expensive. They ran like 30 bucks, something like that. But this one feels really smooth. I don't need to replace it, but if you do, or if you want to upgrade, that's what you need to figure out, those 3 measurements by taking this out to be able to replace that. So that's this guy here. So after this, putting it back in, you want to clean all these threads out really good. You can use a light degreaser, but not too much, especially if it's a steel frame. If it's an alloy, you don't have to worry about corrosion, but you don't want too many liquids going in here if it's a steel frame. And you want to clean off all the threads here. So this one's actually a pretty new, so it's really not dirty, but you'll find a whole bunch of weird gunk in there if it's been old. So I like to put a layer of grease on both sides. Also here. Also the cup. We'll get that here in a second, but we'll just get this one here. So again, alloy frame with hardened steel. You want to do this gently so that first thread catches. You don't want to force it. And if you have a hard time catching that first thread, you can take, again, like a carpenter's knife or something of that nature, and it's backwards, like pedaling backwards is tightening on these. These are right and left, so you want to make sure you're getting the right side on first. Sometimes you can start off backing it off to find that thread. But it needs to go straight in there, like so. Once it catches, I get the tool in there so I can get a little bit better grip. And going pedaling backwards and backwards and backwards. This is fitting into place quite nicely. There are some videos out there. I have not tried it myself, but some people have actually overhauled these guys. I don't think that's for the cost and the time. Very good idea. just get yourself a new cartridge bottom bracket. Like so. That's nice and tight. Onto the other side. So you can still see the exposed bearing on this side. Obviously we want to put this back in there. And I like to put a little bit of grease inside here. The threads are already greased, so we'll be able to get some in there. And again, hardened steel versus alloy, you want to make sure it slides in there easily, catches those first couple threads, and again, pedaling backwards is the direction you want to go. Don't ever force it. You cross thread these boogers, it's a mess. They can be fixed with a thread chaser. It's a $300 tool, or you take it to your bike shop and pay your local mechanic 20, 30 bucks to fix it, to save your frame, and ask them to put it in the bottom bracket while they're there. So that's why sometimes it's good practice on some bikes. You're doing a complete, build. Chase those threads first, especially if it's a brand new frame. Sometimes you need to do that. A lot of the newer ones are already pre-chased, so you don't have to do that. But back in the day, they were not always the cleanest thing, so sometimes you had to re-chase those threads. There we go. So that's the crank arm for bottom bracket and crank set. Put these back on. You just make them the opposite direction. You can put a little dab of grease on the actual tapered portion. That sometimes helps them to be able to come off. But typically you just tighten these down like so. I'll show you.